The surveyor's map was supposed to show the future. A gleaming path of steel and iron, cutting through the Appalachian wilderness, a promise of progress for a nation still stitching itself back together after the war. It was a simple job for a man named Elias Kline. He was a former Union scout, a man who knew the land like he knew the back of his hand. He'd been hired by the new railroad company to lay out the final stretch of track through the mountain pass. But the land had secrets. And on a crisp morning in 1872, Elias Kline stumbled upon one that would unravel everything he thought he knew about his own history. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble, it seems, had been waiting for him for a long time. The discovery wasn't a skeleton, not at first. It was a small, ironclad box, half buried in the muddy bank of a creek that the new railway line was meant to cross. The metal was rusted, the lot corroded, but the wood inside had been preserved by the cold, dark water. Elias, a practical man, thought it might be a surveyor's tool, something from a crew that came before him. He prized it open with his knife, his fingers numb from the early spring chill. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather journal. The pages were swollen, the ink faded, but the handwriting was still legible. It was a name he recognized, a name that sent a cold shiver down his spine. The name of his own father. A man who had died in these very mountains, 30 years before, leaving a young Elias and his mother to fend for themselves. The journal wasn't a daily record of life on the trail. It was a chronicle of fear. The entries were erratic, sometimes dated weeks apart, and they spoke of a menace lurking in the woods. A threat the elder Kline was trying to track, trying to understand. The final entry was just a single line, written with a trembling hand: "They are not men. And I fear they have found me." This discovery, the simple act of digging into the past, would lead Elias Kline down a path far darker than any he had walked during the war. A path that began with a forgotten crime in a forgotten valley, and ended with a truth that the railroad, the county, and even his own family had tried to bury for a lifetime. The location was the heart of the Green Mountains, a place so remote and rugged that it had been one of the last corners of Vermont to be truly settled. The year was 1872, a time of immense change in the state. The railroad, the very thing Elias was helping to build, was the lifeblood of this transformation. Before the train, Vermont was isolated. The Green Mountains were a formidable barrier, making travel and trade a near Herculean task. The arrival of the railroads, starting in the late 1840s, had opened the state to the world, but it also brought the chaos and opportunity of the Gilded Age. It was a period of immense cultural mixing. French Canadians, Irish immigrants, and the mountain people, the native Vermonter families who had lived in the hills for generations, all found themselves living and working in close quarters. This melting pot was a place of progress, but also of tension and suspicion. As the documentary footage shows, these communities were built on a foundation of survival. The men who came to work the railroads were a hardened lot, often carrying the trauma of the Civil War with them. They were scouts, trackers, laborers, and dreamers, each with a past they were trying to outrun. This was the world Elias Kline was a part of. He was a man of few words, his face weathered and etched with the quiet sadness of a veteran. He didn't seek out company, preferring the silence of the woods to the raucous, dangerous atmosphere of the construction camps. This solitude had served him well as a scout, but it also made him an outsider. A man who kept his own secrets. The journal of his father, which he now carried on his person, had transformed his routine survey work into a personal mission. He knew the mountains better than anyone, knew the old logging trails and the forgotten homesteads. He began to follow the cryptic clues his father had left behind, his notes describing a hunt for a prize that was not gold. Elias's father, it seemed, had not died in a simple hunting accident, as the family had been told. He had been murdered. The journal spoke of a secret meeting at an abandoned sawmill on the banks of the Black River. The sawmill was long gone, but its rotting foundation was still visible, a ghostly scar on the landscape. Elias, armed with a weary determination, stood on that spot one evening, and in his mind's eye, he saw his father. He saw the fear in his eyes and the shadow that fell upon him. This is where the narrative deepens. The government in Washington, in the aftermath of the Civil War, was obsessed with expansion. The railroad was a tool of that expansion, a manifest destiny etched in steel. But there was a dark side to this progress. Land disputes, a shadow war fought with corrupt land agents and forged documents, were commonplace. These agents were often little more than hired muscle, men who would stop at nothing to acquire the land needed for the railroad, even if it meant getting their hands dirty. Elias's father had been a surveyor in his own right, mapping the very same land years before the war. It was his work that the railroad company had used to plot their current course. His father's death, Elias now understood, was directly linked to his work. He had discovered something. A mistake. A deliberate falsification in the records that dated back to before the war, a secret that someone, or some company, was willing to kill to protect. The first major twist came when Elias decided to visit the county clerk's office in the nearby town of Londonderry. The old building smelled of dust and mildew, a repository of secrets from 100 forgotten families. He requested the original land grants for the territory he was surveying. The clerk, a nervous man named Silas Webb, hesitated. He claimed the records were in disarray, that many documents had been lost in a fire years ago. But Elias, with the patience and persistence of a tracker who had waited for his prey for decades, refused to be deterred. He camped out in the archives, spending his nights reading through yellowing ledgers until he found a discrepancy. A signature that was supposed to be his father's was, in his practiced eye, a crude forgery. Someone had altered the record, making the land parcel appear larger and more valuable. It was a document that changed the ownership of the land, benefiting a mysterious figure named Asa Beecher, a man Elias had never heard of. The clerk, Silas Webb, was no bureaucrat. He was the local agent for the railroad, placed there to guard their secrets. The deeper Elias dug, the more he realized the web of corruption extended far beyond a single land grab. It was tied to a company known as the New England Land and Emigration Company, a corporation with a reputation as black as coal. They were the ones who had hired his father all those years ago, and they were the ones who had likely ordered his death. But who was Asa Beecher? The name led Elias to a dusty box of old photographs in the clerk's office, pictures of railroad officials and politicians. One of them, a tall, gaunt man with a thick beard and a cold, predatory smile, was identified as Asa Beecher. He was a land consultant, a polite term for an agent who secured property through any means necessary. He was long dead, but his legacy, the falsified map, was still in use. Elias was sitting on a powder keg of a conspiracy, one that stretched back to before the Civil War and involved the families of the men who were now building the railroad. This is the point where the story takes a true crime turn, moving from a personal mystery to a systemic investigation. Elias wasn't just searching for a historical truth, he was searching for justice for his father. His investigation led him to a forgotten village, a place called Mud Hollow, a settlement of Irish immigrants who had been driven off the land by the company decades before. He spoke to the descendants, old women with eyes full of ancient grief, who told him stories of the Beecher men, a gang of thugs who would ride into the settlement at night, burning homes and terrorizing families. He had found his suspects, or rather, the men who had been the instruments of violence. But who had given the orders? The search for the prize his father had discovered, the key to the whole conspiracy, became an obsession. The prize wasn't gold or land. Elias discovered from an old Bible, hidden in the wall of an abandoned cabin in the hollow, a folded piece of paper. On it was a list of names. A roster. It wasn't a list of suspects, it was a list of victims. More than that, it was a list of his own relatives, ancestors he had never known he had, who had been systematically swindled out of their land. The Beecher conspiracy wasn't just a crime against a man, it was a crime against his entire bloodline. His father hadn't been trying to find treasure, he had been trying to solve a mystery of his own, to uncover the truth of his family's murder. With this revelation, Elias Kline knew he was no longer a spectator to history. He was its main character. He began to feel eyes on him, a sense of being watched whenever he ventured too close to the work sites or the old hunting grounds. His crew was wary of him, whispering that he was haunted, that the mountain had gotten into his head. He was an outcast among his own, but he was too close to the truth to stop. His primary evidence was the Bible, a physical connection to the past that the railroad had tried to erase. But it was his father's journal that provided the final pieces of the puzzle. He had been following a trail of land grants, forged signatures, and secret meetings at the sawmill. He realized his father had been hired by the New England Land and Emigration Company to find a lost survey of the land. A true survey that contradicted the one the company was using to sell land. The company was built on a lie. When his father discovered the lie, he was silenced. Elias decided to meet with the man in charge of the current railroad construction, the chief engineer, a man named Alastair Finch. Finch was a wealthy, powerful man, the public face of the company. He was respected, a pillar of the community. Elias, armed with the evidence of his father's murder and the fake land grants, was sure he could find an ally in the law. He approached Finch in his office, a luxurious carriage outfitted as a mobile command center. Elias laid out his evidence, the journal, the Bible, the forged signatures. He demanded an investigation. Finch studied the documents with a look of cold fascination, not surprise. He then said something that shook Elias to his core. He admitted he knew. He claimed that the Beecher men had been a historical problem, ghosts of the past. He said Elias was on a fool's errand, digging up old bones that were better left buried. His dismissive tone was more than mere dismissal. It was a threat. He told Elias that digging up the past was a good way to get buried right along with it. The conversation was a pivotal point, the moment when Elias realized the system itself was corrupt. The man who was supposed to be the guardian of the project was complicit in its cover-up. This is where we introduce a secondary investigation, one that runs parallel to Elias's own. A newspaperman from Boston, a young, ambitious reporter named Julian Croft, had heard rumors of corruption and unsolved murders in the Vermont hills. Croft was a man of a new generation, a believer in the power of the press to expose injustice, inspired by the great muckrakers of the era. He arrived in the construction town, asking pointed questions of the workers and the local saloon owners. He was seen as a threat by Finch's men. They warned him to leave, to find a story elsewhere. Croft, however, was a bulldog. He tracked down Elias, and the two men, the quiet tracker and the brash city reporter, formed an unlikely alliance. Croft had access to a world Elias didn't understand, a world of corporate records and telegraph wires. The investigation moved at a rapid pace. Croft began to wire his contacts in Boston, asking about the New England Land and Emigration Company. He discovered the company had gone bankrupt years ago, but its assets had been quietly absorbed by another corporation, one with ties to Finch. Meanwhile, Elias began to locate the families of the men listed in the Bible, the families who had been tricked out of their land. He found a pattern, a systematic theft that had robbed generations of farmers and woodcutters of their homes and their livelihoods. It wasn't just a financial crime, it was a murder of the spirit. One of the most tragic revelations came when Elias interviewed the last living member of the Campbell family, an old woman named Maggie. The Campbells had been one of the first families to settle the valley. She told him the story of her grandfather, a man who had tried to fight the railroad in court. He was found dead at the bottom of a ravine, and his land was seized for unpaid taxes. The tax records, Elias realized, were as fictitious as the land grants. Maggie's voice cracked as she spoke, the memory of a long-lost home bringing her to tears. It was a human cost to the conspiracy that was more powerful than any ledger book. It was a melancholic reminder that the people at the center of this story were real, and their suffering was profound. This created a turning point. The conspiracy was now understood to be far more than a simple murder. It was a system of oppression, a web of greed that had ensnared dozens of families and had been protected by a decades-long cover-up. The protagonists had moved from solving a mystery to confronting a systemic injustice. The plot thickened when a mysterious letter arrived for Julian Croft at the local post office. It wasn't signed, but it provided the final missing piece of the puzzle. The letter named the prize Elias's father had been looking for. It was a master survey map, the original, true survey of the territory that would expose the entire fraud. The letter claimed the map was hidden inside the walls of the old courthouse, the one that had supposedly burned down and destroyed all the records. It was another twist, the fire had been a cover-up. The map was still there. They had to go and get it. This was the new objective. A heist of the truth. Elias and Julian devised a plan to retrieve the map. It was the most dangerous part of the journey. The old courthouse was now a private home, occupied by a former sheriff who had worked for Beecher. They knew the man, a brute named Uriah Stokes, was in the pocket of the company. They waited for nightfall, moving through the shadows like two ghosts. They found the map, a massive roll of parchment, exactly where the letter had said it would be. But their discovery came with a violent price. They were ambushed by Stokes and his men. In the fray, Julian Croft, the young reporter full of hope, was struck down with a brutal blow to the head. He survived, but just barely. Elias was able to escape with the map, leaving his friend bleeding on the floor of the house. The betrayal cut deep. The very men who had been hired to build the future were willing to kill to protect the lies of the past. As Elias cradled the map in his shaking hands, he realized the map was the truth. It was the key to the whole conspiracy. But it was also the reason his father was dead. The court case that followed was a spectacle. Elias Kline, with the help of a young lawyer from Montpelier, filed a federal lawsuit against the railroad company and its current shareholders. The case was not just about his father's murder, it was about land rights, fraud, and the legality of the railroad's entire operation. The court was packed, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The corrupt old documents were dragged into the light. Witness after witness came forward, their testimonies painting a damning picture of the Beecher men. But Finch, the chief engineer, had a surprise. He took the stand and admitted to everything. He admitted to knowing about the fraud, to covering it up, to inheriting the company secrets. He claimed he was a company man, that it was his duty to protect the project, and that the past was simply the price of progress. He confessed to the crime of covering up history but denied any direct involvement in the murder of Elias's father. The confession was not one of guilt, but of cynicism. He showed no remorse, only the cold logic of a corporate mind. The confession was a masterstroke. He was trying to pivot the narrative from a murder to a business dispute. He wanted the public to see the deaths as a historical cost of doing business, a problem that belonged to a bygone era. This was the central twist, the moment everything was laid bare. The map was the truth. The map was the accusation. And the conspiracy was now a matter of public record. However, Finch and his allies still controlled the narrative in the court, trying to frame the entire affair as a simple forgery case. They claimed the map was a fake, created by Elias's father to extort the company. They used the best lawyers money could buy, employing every trick in the book to discredit the evidence. The trial became a battleground of interpretations. But the map was irrefutable. Elias presented it to the jury. He showed them the signatures and the dates, tracing them back to the years before the war. He showed them how the railroad's current route deviated from the historical path, a route that was now being used to steal land from families whose ancestors were still alive and were victims of the original swindle. It was a slow, painstaking dismantling of the company's entire case. It wasn't just a map, it was a work of art in forensic history. The emotional revelation came when Elias finally testified about his father. He described his childhood, the long years of wondering, and the pain of finally understanding what had happened. He spoke not to the judge or the jury, but to the ghost of his father, a man he had never truly known but was now bringing justice for. It was this testimony that shattered the courtroom silence. The story of a son finding his father's truth in the bottom of a creek, it was a story that belonged in an Appalachian folk ballad. The final shocking truth, however, was yet to come. The judge, who had presided over the entire trial, had been carefully listening. In his final summation, he didn't just rule in favor of Elias. He did something unprecedented. He ruled that the fraud was not just a civil matter, but a criminal conspiracy that extended all the way to the office of the governor of the state, a man who had been a silent partner in the New England Land and Emigration Company. The judge's gavel came down like a thunderclap. He threw out all the corporate claims to the land, restoring it to the original heirs. The railroads were allowed to run their trains, but the land was no longer theirs. It had been taken from them. The company's entire business model had been built on a foundation of lies and murder. It was the biggest corporate takedown in the state's history. The trail of evidence was a roadmap to a story of greed, violence, and a cover-up so old that its architects were dead and buried. The trial didn't just solve a mystery, it rewrote the history of the entire region. But it was too late for many. The land, when it was returned to the descendants, was unrecognizable. The forests were gone, the streams polluted. The new owners, the children and grandchildren of the victims, were left with nothing more than a tangle of old records and a legacy of grief. They could not reclaim the past. Elias Kline, in the end, got what he had been searching for, a truth that had been kept from him for 30 years. He had given his father a proper burial, not in the ground, but in the pages of history. But in doing so, he had torn a wound open for the community. He had brought a dark secret into the light, but the light didn't necessarily bring healing. It brought division, anger, and a renewed sense of loss. The documentary ends where it began, at the creek. The railroad line, which had been the catalyst for the entire story, is there, a sleek symbol of progress. Elias stands by the tracks. He is an old man now, the weight of the decades visible on his face. He is no longer a surveyor, no longer a tracker. He is a keeper of memories. He holds a small, weathered stone in his hand, a stone from the foundation of that old sawmill where his father met his fate. He looks at the trains, their whistles blowing, carrying passengers on their way to lives of ease and progress. And he knows that they are traveling over a graveyard. The truth is out there, but it has been paved over with rails. The dead have a voice, but it is often drowned out by the sound of the wheels. And as he walks back into the woods, he takes one last look at the creek, the spot where it all began. He wonders, quietly, if his father's ghost is at peace. Or if, like the truth, it's still out there in the hills, waiting to be found.